From New York, this is Democracy Now!
Every day we are dealing with a lot of conflicts and challenges in the planet. And the world's eyes have been in Venezuela, especially in the last few days. Yesterday, my office made a statement regarding the situation that we hope violence will end and that respect for human rights will be part of the solution.
As the United Nations calls for a peaceful resolution to the crisis in Venezuela, the Venezuelan opposition is openly asking the United States and allied nations to consider using military force to topple the Venezuelan president, Nicolás Maduro. This comes as at least 4 people died as violence broke out on the Venezuelan borders with Colombia and Brazil, as the U.S. and allies attempted to defy the Venezuelan government and bring so-called humanitarian aid into Venezuela. We'll spend the hour with Venezuela's Foreign Minister, Jorge Arriaza.
Venezuela is a peaceful country, and that we have to stop any war in our hemisphere. We can find our own solutions, sovereign solutions in Venezuela, and the U.S. government and no other government has nothing to do with our internal affairs. We can guarantee that there will be peace in Venezuela if we respect the Charter of the United Nations and the Venezuelan constitutions and law.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Venezuela's opposition is calling on the United States and allied nations to consider using military force to topple the government of Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro. This comes as U.S. Vice President Mike Pence heads to Bogotá, Colombia today to discuss next steps with regional leaders and Venezuela's self-proclaimed president, the opposition leader Juan Guaidó. The meeting comes after a dramatic weekend which saw the Venezuelan military blocking the delivery of so-called humanitarian aid from entering Venezuela at the Colombia and Brazilian borders. At least 4 people died after clashes broke out between forces loyal to Maduro and supporters of the opposition. The United Nations, the Red Cross, and other relief organizations have refused to work with the U.S. on delivering aid to Venezuela, which they say is politically motivated. Over the weekend, U.S. officials ramped up pressure on the Maduro government. On Sunday, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said Maduro's days in office are numbered. Republican Senator Marco Rubio tweeted the violence on the border, quote, opened the door to various potential multilateral actions not on the table just 24 hours ago, unquote. Senator Rubio also tweeted images of Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi, including one of him after he was killed following the U.S. bombing campaign dragged bloody through the streets. We'll have more on the situation in Venezuela with Venezuela's Foreign Minister, Jorge Arriaza, after headlines. Meanwhile, in New York City, protesters took to the streets Saturday for a No War on Venezuela demonstration.
The entire Puerto Rican nation was taken over by the United States, and now they want to do the same thing to Venezuela, to make Venezuela a colony of the United States, so that because they're not interested in the freedom of the Venezuelans or nothing. They want to get the natural resources of Venezuela, just like they are doing to Puerto Rico and to other countries in the world.
On Friday, President Trump issued a rule barring abortion providers or groups that refer patients for abortions from federal funds known as Title X. Planned Parenthood be one of the main groups affected by the new gag rule. Title X covers non-abortion services like STD prevention, cancer screenings, and contraception, and provides over $280 million in funding for 4 million mostly low-income women every year. Dr. Lena Wen, the president of Planned Parenthood Federation of America, tweeted in response to the news, quote, "The Trump-Pence administration knows what it's doing. In a country where racism and discrimination have caused rampant inequalities and disparities, an attack on Title X, a program for patients with low incomes, is an attack on poor women and people of color," she said. A number of states, including New York and California, have already announced plans to sue the Trump administration over the rule. President Trump is set to meet with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un in Vietnam this week for their second summit. In a direct contradiction of previous statements by the president, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said Sunday North Korea still poses a nuclear threat. While Trump is attending the highly anticipated summit, his former lawyer and fixer Michael Cohen will testify in front of 3 House committees about his work for Donald Trump. Also this week, the House is scheduled to hold hearings on the Trump administration's family separation policy. The House Oversight Committee will vote Tuesday on authorizing subpoenas for the departments responsible for implementing and overseeing the separation policy, which has separated thousands of children from their families. House Democrats are set to vote Tuesday on a resolution blocking President Trump's national emergency declaration to construct a U.S.-Mexico border wall. It's unclear, though, if such a measure would pass in the Republican-controlled Senate. Trump has vowed to veto the bill. Meanwhile, the Washington Post is reporting a bipartisan group of 58 former national security officials will publicly rebuke the president's national emergency declaration today. In Sudan, President Omar al-Bashir declared a 1-year countrywide state of emergency Friday after over 2 months of widespread anti-government protests calling for his resignation. He also dissolved central and state governments. Rights groups say more than 50 people have been killed by Sudanese security forces since the protests began. The government has also been accused of jailing hundreds of activists, opponents, and critics of al-Bashir and of shutting down press outlets and barring foreign reporters from covering the uprising. Protests continued through the weekend, defying the president's order. In Nigeria, civil society groups reported nearly 40 people were killed across the country in election-related violence over the weekend. Nigerians headed to the polls Saturday, 1 week after elections were delayed due to logistical reasons. The Nigerian president, Muhammadu Buhari, is seeking a second term, running against dozens of challengers amidst a spate of recent violence and insurgent attacks by Boko Haram. A newly released United Nations report found a record number of Afghan civilians were killed last year due to an increase in airstrikes by U.S. and Afghan forces and on-the-ground suicide bombings by insurgent groups, primarily the Taliban and the Islamic State. The now more than 17-year-old conflict claimed over 3,800 civilian lives in 2018, over 900 of which were children. The numbers represent an 11% increase in civilian deaths from the year before. The report comes as peace talks between the U.S. and the Taliban resume in Qatar today. In Gaza, mourners gathered Saturday after a Palestinian teenager was shot and killed by Israeli forces Friday. Israeli soldiers shot 15-year-old Yusuf Saeed Hussein al-Daya as he attended the weekly Great March of Return demonstration at the separation barrier with Israel. Around 40 other people were wounded. In Israel, embattled Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has made a pact with several far-right parties to form a new coalition ahead of elections in April. One of the groups, Otzma Yehudit, or Jewish Power, has been compared to the KKK for its racist, anti-Arab and homophobic beliefs. The parties called for annexing the occupied Palestinian territories, expelling Israeli Arabs, and a ban on relationships between Jews and Arabs. The group was formed by supporters of the fundamentalist Rabbi Meir Kahane. An earlier iteration of Otzma Yehudit was banned by Israel and designated a terror organization in the 1990s by both Israel and the United States. The move was swiftly condemned, including by pro-Israeli government groups such as AIPAC and the Anti-Defamation League. President Trump announced via Twitter Sunday he's delaying an increase in tariffs on Chinese products after negotiators made, quote, substantial progress in the ongoing trade discussions between Washington and Beijing. A trade truce between the two countries was initially set to expire March 1st and would have increased tariffs from 10% to 25% on $200 billion of Chinese goods. California Senator Dianne Feinstein is coming under fire after a video showing her interaction with a group of young climate activists, some as young as 7 years old, went viral over the weekend. In the video, Senator Feinstein dismisses the students' demands to take action on climate change, including supporting the Green New Deal, which was recently introduced as a resolution by New York Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Massachusetts Senator Ed Markey.
Scientists have said that we have 12 years to turn this around.
Well, it's not going to get turned around in 10 years. What we can do,
Senator, if this doesn't get turned around in 10 years, you're looking at the faces of the people who are going to be living with these consequences.
The government is supposed to be for the people and by the people and all for the people.
You know what's interesting about this group is I've been doing this for 30 years. I know what I'm doing. You come in here and you say it has to be my way or the highway.
President Trump announced via Twitter Friday he'll nominate Kelly Knight Craft, the current U.S. ambassador to Canada, to be the new U.S. ambassador to the United Nations after Heather Nauert withdrew from consideration earlier this month. Craft's husband is the head of the coal company Alliance Resource Partners, and together the couple donated around $1.5 million to Republican campaigns in 2016, including over $270,000 to then-candidate Trump. They reportedly also are regulars at the Trump International Hotel in Washington, D.C. Kraft has previously denied climate change by declaring, quote, "There are sciences on both sides of the debate that are accurate," she said. R. Kelly is expected to appear in a Chicago court today after he was arrested and charged Friday with 10 counts of aggravated criminal sexual assault. The charges involve 4 women and girls, 3 of whom were under the age of 17 at the time of the alleged crimes. A judge set bail at $1 million, which R. Kelly has not yet been able to make, and forced the singer to surrender his passport. Lawyer Michael Avenatti, who says he's representing an R. Kelly whistleblower, says he gave prosecutors a tape showing the singer engaging in sexual acts with a 14-year-old girl. The arrest follows 2 decades of accusations against R. Kelly, who's never been criminally convicted. Last month, the explosive documentary Surviving R. Kelly thrust the case back into the spotlight. Activists have been calling for justice for Black girls and women preyed on by R. Kelly, and for the music industry to disassociate itself from the musician with the Mute R. Kelly campaign. To see our interviews on Surviving R. Kelly, go to DemocracyNow.org. The billionaire owner of the New England Patriots, Robert Kraft, was charged Friday for soliciting sex as part of a sting operation investigating prosecution and sex trafficking at day spas in Florida. Hundreds of others have also been charged. Police officers say many of the women involved in the case came to the U.S. from China on temporary visas, and some reportedly had sex with 1,000 men a year. Prosecutors say they have video evidence of Kraft engaging in the criminal acts. Super Bowl Sunday is believed to be one of the biggest days of the year for sex trafficking. Massachusetts Senator and 2020 presidential hopeful Elizabeth Warren announced her campaign will not fundraise through donor calls or by holding dinners and other events with wealthy supporters. Warren previously announced she would reject any corporate PAC money for her campaign and challenge other Democratic Party candidates to do the same. Of the recent announcement, Senator Warren said, quote, "My presidential primary campaign will be run on the principle of equal access for anybody who joins it." In Hollywood, the 91st Academy Awards were held Sunday evening, celebrating a diverse range of awardees and a number of firsts, including director Spike Lee's first competitive Academy Award for Best Adapted Screenplay for his film BlacKkKlansman.
The 2020 presidential election is around the corner. Let's all mobilize. Let's all be on the right side of history. Make the moral choice between love versus hate. Let's do the right thing,
said Spike Lee when he received the award. Green Book won for Best Picture at the end of the evening, despite facing criticism for historical inaccuracies. Spike Lee, who reportedly attempted to walk out of the theater when Green Book was named the winner, BlacKkKlansman was up 2 for Best Film, said, quote, "I thought I was courtside at the Garden and the ref made a bad call." Rami Malek won Best Actor for his portrayal of lead singer of Queen, Freddie Mercury. In his acceptance speech, Malek, an Egyptian-American actor, said, quote, "We made a film about a gay man, an immigrant, who lived his life just unapologetically himself. We're longing for stories like this," he said. Alfonso Cuarón won Best Director for Roma, which also won Best Foreign Language Film. The record-shattering film Black Panther won 3 Oscars, including 2 that mark the first African-American winners in their categories, Hannah Beachler for production design and Ruthie Carter for costumes. And in more entertainment news, the Independent Spirit Awards were held in Santa Monica, California, Saturday, right before the Oscars. If Beale Street Could Talk, the feature film based on the 1974 James Baldwin novel, took home Best Director and Best Feature. Sorry to Bother You won Best First Feature. This is director Boots Riley accepting the award.
This is a film that takes place in an office place and is the first one that I know that has class struggle in it. Even though class struggle is happening every day when you're on your jobs and you're seeing that happen, for some reason, we thought we had to edit that out of our stories.
Boots Riley went on to call on viewers to speak out against U.S. intervention in Venezuela.
The CIA is trying to have a coup in Venezuela. I haven't been watching since I've been here, so they might be doing it right now, and we should all be putting our voices out to stop the U.S. from having regime change for oil in Venezuela.
After Boots Riley mic was cut off on stage, he continued to speak out on the issue backstage, raising the U.S.'s history of regime change in Chile, Iraq, and Guatemala as well. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world. Venezuela's opposition is calling on the United States and allied nations to consider using military force to topple the government of Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro. This comes as U.S. Vice President Mike Pence heads to Bogotá, Colombia, today to meet with regional leaders and Venezuela's self-proclaimed president, opposition leader Juan Guaidó. A top Venezuelan opposition leader named Julio Borges told the Wall Street Journal, quote, "We will present firm positions which are an escalation of diplomatic measures and political measures, including the use of force, for blocking the humanitarian aid and generating an unprecedented violence." The meeting comes after a dramatic weekend which saw the Venezuelan military block the delivery of so-called humanitarian aid from entering the country at the Colombia and Brazilian borders. At least 4 people died and hundreds were injured after clashes broke out between forces loyal to Maduro and the supporters of the opposition. According to some reports, supporters of the opposition threw rocks and Molotov cocktails. The Venezuelan security forces and civilian groups known as colectivos responded with force, including tear gas and rubber bullets. 2 trucks carrying aid were set on fire on the Colombian side of the border.
The United Nations, the Red Cross, and other relief organizations have refused to work with the U.S. on delivering aid to Venezuela, which they say is politically motivated. Venezuela has allowed aid to be flown in from Russia and from some international organizations, but it's refused to allow in the aid from the United States, describing it as a Trojan horse for an eventual U.S. invasion. Over the weekend, U.S. officials ramped up pressure on the Maduro government. On Sunday, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said Maduro's days in office are numbered. He also threatened more sanctions are coming. Republican Senator Marco Rubio of Florida tweeted the violence on the border, quote, opened the door to various potential multilateral actions not on the table just 24 hours ago, unquote. In what many saw as a cryptic threat to Maduro, Rubio tweeted an image of a bloodied Muammar Gaddafi as he was being killed following the U.S. bombing campaign of Libya. Rubio also tweeted photos of former Panamanian leader Manuel Noriega, who was removed from power during the U.S. invasion in 1989, remained in a U.S. jail for years. We're joined right now by the Venezuelan Foreign Minister, Jorge Arreaza. Welcome back to Democracy Now! It's good to have you with us.
Thank you very much.
Can you start off by talking about what happened on the borders? Why did at least 4 people die?
Yes, thank you very much, Amy, Juan. It's a pleasure, my honor to be here once again. And it's important for the American people to listen to us as well, because we have what we believe is our truth, or in any case, it's the other version that you will not hear in the traditional mainstream media. So I must say that what we saw last Saturday in the border, in both borders, with Colombia and Brazil, this was a spectacle. It was a show. You know? There were hundreds of journalists of TV stations broadcasting live. And the intention was, as you said, we believe it's a Trojan horse. It was to break our sovereignty with a so-called humanitarian aid, which is not. And it reminds us of, for example, Dominican Republic, 1965, where after the so-called humanitarian aid, 8,000 Marines came in, overthrew the government of Juan Bosch, and they took power and installed a dictatorship for decades. So what we saw is, Juan said that the colectivos had answered with rubber bullets. No, it was the National Guard and the police. The front line was the police, the Policía Nacional Bolivariana. The second line, the National Guard. And then, of course, there were people that wanted to defend our sovereignty and that were there also. No one was killed in Táchira in the Colombian side, which was the real problem. The events happened in Brazil, in Santa Helena, and in the Brazilian border, where there's another story. There's something related to the indigenous groups of my country, which we defend and love, but there's a mayor that has been elected, and he's from the party of Guaidó, and they tried to get into a military unit, and something happened there. And it's still not clear how these people, 4 people died. It's under investigations. We don't know where the fire came from. But when you see the TV, it seems that Maduro gave the order to his military to fire on the people, and that is not true. We were very, very prudent, and we resisted an invasion somehow, and it stopped. And now they are frustrated, and now they're going to Bogota to take decisions with the real boss of the Grupo de Lima, the Lima Group, who is Mike Pence, and he's going to dictate the instructions and orders today in this group.
Did the soldiers have live bullets?
No, they didn't. We never use what you saw on the bridge on Táchira is what we saw every single day during 4 months in Caracas, in Maracaibo, in Valencia in 2017. Even worse then, because it was every single day and people actually died, and the people from the opposition had weapons, fire weapons as well. So for us, it was something smooth if we compare it to what we have suffered in the past with all this wild opposition we have in Venezuela.
You mentioned Mike Pence as being the real boss of the Lima Group. I wanted to ask you about this. To me, it's astonishing that Guaidó declared himself to be president the day after speaking on the phone with the vice president of the United States. The idea that a vice president would have a conversation with an opposition leader and immediately after the opposition leader declares himself president, then come out publicly with a video backing him.
This was a plan. It was activated last year when they decided not to recognize the results of the presidential elections. And then they had to wait for the day of the inauguration of President Maduro, and this plan was activated. And it cannot be a coincidence that after this man goes to the rally, and in the middle of the street, in a square, public square, he raises his hand and he self-proclaims as president of Venezuela with no formality, no constitution provision to support what he was doing. Immediately, Mike Pence recognized him, and then Trump and the presidents of Chile, Argentina, Colombia, and all these countries that are against Venezuela and following U.S. orders. So that was a plan, well organized from much before. And we have to understand this. Nothing is a coincidence when it comes to Venezuela and the U.S.
Well, this is Venezuelan opposition leader, the self-proclaimed President Juan Guaidó, set to have his first meeting with Vice President Mike Pence, speaking in Colombia.
Que el día lunes
Participaré.
I will take part in this group, this meeting of the Lima Group, to meet with everyone, foreign ministers from the region, as well as with the United States Vice President Mike Pence, to discuss possible diplomatic action of cooperation, or rather sovereign, as it should be for each country, in a show of respect for the Constitution, so as to advance on this issue.
So if you can respond to this, and Guaido is apparently meeting Vice President Pence for the first time today, and also, will you let him back into Venezuela? He's in Colombia now.
I don't know if he's coming back, if he's willing to come back to Venezuela, maybe, or what his plans are. But in any case, he's going to meet with his boss, with Mr. Pence, and he's going to ask Mr. Pence for a military intervention in Venezuela. He already said it, It's sad, but it's also insane. You cannot believe or tell the people that you are the president, so-called president of your country, and ask for a foreign intervention against your people, against your family, against your friends. No, because bombs will not differentiate who's Chavista and who's not Chavista. So I believe I can almost not believe when I hear these people calling for these things.
I wanted to ask you about Guaido and to recommend an article that Max Blumenthal wrote a few weeks ago in Gray Zone called "The Making of Juan Guaido: How the U.S. Regime Change Laboratory Created Venezuela's Coup Leader." And in his article, he says that basically many of the opposition, including Guaido, were groomed and trained by a group called the Center for Applied Nonviolent Action Strategies, which is specializes in regime changes around the world, and also by the intelligence group Stratfor. I wonder if you could talk about Guaido's history. He was virtually unknown even in Venezuela until a few weeks ago.
I believe that 99% of the Venezuelan people didn't know him January the 4th, when after January the 5th he was sworn as a president of the National Assembly, which was correct, and then he went on with this plan. But this generation of youngsters in Venezuela, they were trained by the intelligence groups of the United States and of other countries in order to make this regime change. What we saw in Ukraine, what we saw in some countries in the north of Africa, it's the same people training with all these color revolutions and whatever. So Leopoldo Lopez, Juan Guaido, it's a generation that was prepared for this. They know how to make violence protests. They know the speech, even the words they use. So nothing is coincidental. This is all part of a plan.
We're going to break and then come back to this discussion. Our guest for the hour is Venezuelan Foreign Minister Jorge Arreaza. We'll be back with him in a minute.
Tiene que ser hombre para trabajar, que aun siendo niño tiene que ser hombre para trabajar. Humanidad, humanidad, hay motivos de alegrías, pero de tristezas hay muchos más. Hay motivos de alegrías, pero de tristezas hay muchos más. Pobre de
Humanidad by Ali Primera here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We continue to look at the crisis in Venezuela, where the U.S. pressure to topple President Maduro's government has been building for years. Former FBI Director Andrew McCabe reveals Trump privately discussed going to war with Venezuela as far back as 2017. In his new book, McCabe writes, quote, "Then the president talked about Venezuela. That's the country we should be going to war with," he said. "They have all that oil and they're right on our back door." In September, the New York Times reported the Trump administration conducted secret meetings with rebellious military officers in Venezuela to discuss overthrowing Maduro. In November, John Bolton accused Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua of being part of a troika of tyranny.
The U.S. intensified its efforts once Juan Guaido became head of the National Assembly and led an effort to declare Maduro a usurper in an effort to remove him from office. On the day of Maduro's inauguration, January 10th, the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo called Guaido to congratulate him on his election victory to head the National Assembly. Then National Security Advisor John Bolton announced, quote, "The United States does not recognize Venezuelan dictator Nicolas Maduro's illegitimate claim to power," unquote. Vice President Mike Pence then spoke to Guaido on the night before he declared himself to be president of Venezuela on January 23rd to offer U.S. support. Then, on January 24th, Bolton openly admitted the U.S. actions are motivated by Venezuela's massive oil reserves. He told Fox Business it would be good for the United States if American companies produce the oil in Venezuela. Still with us, Venezuelan Foreign Minister Jorge Ariaza. I wanted to go to the latest threats over the weekend, both a clip and a tweet. I wanted to turn to the role of Marco Rubio. But first, let's go to CNN's Jake Tapper questioning Secretary of State Mike Pompeo Sunday.
How much does Venezuela's oil reserves, oil capabilities, factor into what the United States is doing in Venezuela?
We're aimed at a singular mission, ensuring that the Venezuelan people get the democracy that they so richly deserve. I am confident that the Venezuelan people will ensure that Maduro's days are numbered.
Secretary of State Pompeo also said the United States would pursue further sanctions on Venezuela. Meanwhile, Florida's Republican Senator Marco Rubio tweeted the violence on the border, quote, opened the door to various potential multilateral actions not on the table just 24 hours ago. In what many saw as a threat to Maduro, Rubio tweeted an image of a bloodied Muammar Gaddafi as he was being killed following the U.S. bombing campaign of Libya. Rubio also tweeted photos of former Panamanian leader Manuel Noriega, who was removed from power during the U.S. invasion in 1989. Foreign Minister Ariaza, can you talk about these latest threats?
I don't think that this man, Marco Rubio, can represent the American people, no? The values by which the American people is known. Because how can you threat a president, a threat against his life so openly? And what kind of representative is him from the people? Not even from the people from Florida, no? Of course, there's a lot of domestic politics here because Trump needs to win Florida. I believe that Trump's days are numbered because I truly believe that the American people will not re-elect Trump. So that's the president that has the days numbered, really. But this, I believe Marco Rubio and Bolton are paid by each tweet about Venezuela. It's an obsession. On Saturday, it was, I don't know, if 40 tweets or more from Bolton and from Marco Rubio about the situation in Venezuela and telling lies. It was fake news all over his information. So how can the electors, the voters that elected Marco Rubio stand this from happening? He has to be stopped as the war has to be stopped on Venezuela.
I wanted to ask you about the situation inside Venezuela. And obviously, the opposition has grown. There are some accounts that even though President Maduro won the most recent election, that he's deeply unpopular because of the economic crisis in the country, hyperinflation. Could you talk about the economic crisis? Has there been mismanagement and has there been a move to greater authoritarianism under President Maduro than there was under President Chavez?
You know, my country at the moment is calm. Everything's still smooth. People are going to their jobs. Students are going to the university or to their schools. People are going to the beach on the weekends. We are almost, next weekend it's Carnival in Venezuela and there's going to be a holiday. And all the pressure comes from abroad, from outside the country. You know? And
but there is a large number of people leaving Venezuela, hasn't there?
Those figures are not clear, but of course there is migration. We are blocked, Juan. In order for us to pay for what we need to produce food or for the medicine we need, we have to, a transaction that should take 48 hours takes 48 days, if it ever happens. No? And of course there are some shortages, but we are better off today than we were a year ago, and much more if we compare it to 2016 or 2017. We have done an effort not to sacrifice $1 bolivar, $1 for the social policies in which we invest a lot of our budget. And we have done an effort to try to manage the economy in spite of the blockade. If you were to sit Mr. Stiglitz or the director of the IMF in the in the chair of the Minister of Finance, and he would say you have to do this, this, and this, and if you take those decisions, nothing's going to happen, or something very different is going to happen that this person expected, because our economy is perturbated all over from abroad. So and I must say that at this moment in time, we are better off. There's more food, there's more medicine, and even some prices are lowering for the first time in 2 or 3 years.
Even with the crippling U.S. sanctions,
yes,
with the amount of money that is being held in British banks, and the U.S. saying they're giving the money from, like the Venezuelan company Citgo, to Guaido, with the IMF reporting that inflation is over 1,000,000%. Many are suffering enormously. Millions have left. According to the UN.
Yes, more than 1 million maybe, but not millions have left. And it's not 1 million, the inflation. Those figures are crazy. But we have an economic crisis. Has there been mismanagement? Maybe. We're not a perfect government, and it's very difficult to know what decisions to take when your economy is under aggression, when there is an economic warfare against your economy. But I can say that the main reason why our economy has trouble is because of the international attack, and specifically this blockade and sanctions from the U.S. If we didn't have those sanctions and that blockade, we could manage our economy. If we had the $30 billion that this blockade has costed over 1 year and a half, and $15 billion that our company Citgo represents as a value of the assets, things would be very different. So we have to understand this. This blockade is being translated into the suffering of many Venezuelans, and this has to be stopped.
I want to ask you about the international community, because in all the commercial press here in the United States, the sense is that the overwhelming number of countries have now declared Venezuelan President Maduro illegitimate, but that's not the reality. The reality is that there are about 60 countries that are now recognizing Guaido, but there are an equal number of countries, and some of the biggest countries in the world, that still recognize President Maduro, and that the United States, neither the United States government nor Guaido has sought to go to the General Assembly to take a vote, because they would lose the vote in the General Assembly. Can you talk about that, the dynamics of the lineup in the international community on this issue?
Yes, the battlefield is in the international sphere at the moment. And I must say that it's 52 governments that have said to recognize Mr. Guaido as the so-called president of Venezuela. This is part of the plan. What governments are this? The U.S., Canada, the governments from the Grupo de Lima, the right-winged governments subordinated to Washington, the European Union, and 2 or 3 more countries in the world. So, but I mean, I had a meeting last Friday with over 60 delegations from all over the world, from the 5 continents, here in the UN. We had a meeting, and we were very satisfied when we listened to countries from Latin America, from the Caribbean, from Africa, from Asia, from even some from Europe, giving support to the Venezuelan constitutional government. But apart from that, because the aim is not to defend Maduro here. The aim is to defend the right to any nation to protect their sovereignty and not to interfere in their internal affairs. It's to protect this, the Charter of the United Nations, the principles and the purposes that there are in this charter. And we are creating a group, not we, it wasn't our initiative. Some countries with our participation are creating a group, which I believe will have more than 80 members to protect the Charter of the United Nations, and we are taking actions with the Secretary General, in the General Assembly, even in the Security Council with this group.
What is happening at the United Nations? You've met with Guterres now, the UN Secretary General, 3 times. We just played a clip of Michelle Bachelet, former president of Chile. What do you want to happen right now? And do you want involvement of the Pope? Do you want involvement of Mexico with the new president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador?
In the United Nations, what's happening is that there's a member of the United Nations, Venezuela, that's been under attack. And the countries that are attacking Venezuela are violating every single principle of the Charter of the United Nations. So we expect for the Secretary General, for the General Assembly, to raise their voice and condemn this intervention in Venezuela and stop and not to be silent when the Charter is being violated. What we are trying to do also in the United Nations is to let them know the truth, what's happening. That's why I have met 3 times with Guterres, but as well, we want the organizations of the United Nations, the agencies, to help us, because it's their duty as well. Because what's the real problem? Banks don't want to work with Venezuela. So any transaction that happens through New York or through London, which are most of the transactions in the Western world, are stopped, are blocked. So we are working with some agencies of the United Nations in order for them to buy what we need in Venezuela, medicines, food, and we will pay this once it's in the Venezuelan territory, in somewhere in the world, in a financial route that we are designing, because we have to look for these ways. We have done it. We're working with China, with Russia, we are working with Turkey very closely, but it's not been enough. So we need also the support of the United Nations organizations. But of course we are sitting around the table. We're waiting for the opposition to sit again, because they usually sit and they stand up and they leave. We're sitting and waiting for Mr. whomever, Guaidó, whomever, to sit down and let's have dialogue. Do we need Mexico's, Uruguay's support, or the countries of the Caribbean? It's welcomed. I believe we don't even need it, because we're Venezuelans and we can solve this amongst Venezuelans. But if they are helping, they are welcomed. And whichever other country that wants to help for a sovereign solution amongst the Venezuelans, they are welcome in my country.
And while this is playing out, though, as you say, you're willing to pay for the supplies you need, but you've got to have the revenue, the sale of oil. With the U.S. market cut off, have other countries stepped forward? I know China has long been buying Venezuelan oil. India has as well. Have these countries been stepping forward to say, we will fill the vacuum and buy more of your oil?
Yes, already. We already have new contracts with some other countries. And I'm not going to name them, because then Mr. Bolton threatens them. No? Immediately when he knew that we had some negotiations with one of the Asian countries, he threatened that country, and he said that they wouldn't be forgotten. So I have to be careful here, but we are already selling our oil, the oil that was meant to come to the U.S., it's being sold to other countries in the world.
Former President Hugo Chavez survived a coup attempt in 2002. You're not only the foreign minister, you're also Chavez's son-in-law. Do you think Maduro will be able to survive this coup attempt?
He has already survived the coup, because the coup was meant to happen between the February the 23rd and the first days of, January the 23rd and the first days of February. It didn't happen. The military stood loyal with the Constitution. And what's happening now is that because the coup failed, now they're looking for what they call other options. And there is when it's dangerous. And I believe that the American people have a word here. You can stop the war if you really tell your Congress and your government and your people and all over the streets, you raise your voice, because that's going to be a war on Venezuela, against the Venezuelan people. Venezuelan people are going to die. There's going to be a bloodshed, but also American soldiers would die, Marines would die in Venezuela, because we know how to resist. We are ready also to defend our homeland, but that's not what we want. I believe that the American people and the American institutions can stop this from happening, this insane proposal of invading Venezuela, and this is the right time to do it.
We're going to break, then come back to this discussion. We're talking to the Foreign Minister of Venezuela, Jorge Arreaza. He is here in New York. He is meeting with the United Nations in Venezuela. Clearly, coup attempt is underway, if not inside Venezuela, outside, because today the Secretary of State, Pompeo, is in Colombia meeting with the the Vice President, Mike Pence, is in Colombia meeting with the Lima Group and the self-proclaimed Venezuelan President Juan Guaido. We will see what happens with that, but we'll talk more about this in a minute. Straight and Tall by Jackie Shane. Shane was a pioneering black transgender singer and songwriter who died last Thursday at her home in Nashville, Tennessee. She was 78 years old. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. We're spending the hour with the Venezuelan Foreign Minister, Jorge Arreaza. Juan?
Well, on Friday, Democracy Now! Spoke to Edgardo Lander, a Venezuelan sociologist and Maduro critic who is also against U.S. regime change. He's a member of the Citizens Platform in Defense of the Constitution and has backed a national referendum on the future of Venezuela.
The Citizens Platform on Defense of the Constitution, as well as other groups, mainly from the left, but not only, have been arguing that we need this consultative referendum in order to have the Venezuelan people decide if they want to have new authorities overall in the country. That is, all the national powers, including the executive and the National Assembly. But that requires an agreement because we need a new National Electoral Council. The current Electoral Council is completely controlled by the government, and it's not trustworthy for the majority of the Venezuelan population.
That was Edgardo Lander, Venezuelan sociologist. Your comments, Foreign Minister, about the possibility of a referendum as a way out of the crisis that's existing now?
First of all, I have a lot of respect for Edgardo Lander, and he used to accompany us for many years. Now he's changed position, but he's a coherent man. And what I do believe is that this Constitution has many solutions that can be studied, but it has to happen in the dialogue process. Now, you cannot impose a solution. You cannot say it's the referendum, or as the US and the European Union say, you have to repeat the presidential elections. We have to sit down with the opposition, and we have to reach political agreements and analyze each option, but not war, but political options, and find our way as Venezuelans, because we're brothers and sisters with the opposition as well. So that's what we have to do, and we're waiting for the opposition. And even the Pope has called the opposition, and we wish that Secretary General Guterres would call the opposition to sit down, because that is the answer to everything. We've been through tougher times in the past in Venezuela, and the opposition sits down and then stands up. But at the moment, they have the order from the Pentagon or the White House telling them, do not sit around the table with the people of Maduro because you are not allowed by us. So we hope that there is some rectification from the opposition, but of course in the U.S. government in order to give them permission to sit down with the Venezuelan government.
So you have this very unusual situation right now. President Trump is flying off to Vietnam to meet with the North Korean leader. You have the Vice President, Pence, who issued this statement in support of Guaido, spoke to him before he announced that he himself was president, not Pence, but Guaido of Venezuela. And so you have Pence and Guaido in Colombia meeting with the Lima Group to get these countries to invade Venezuela. What countries would fend off an invasion, would fight alongside Venezuela?
We have not even thought about that. We're not considering war, no? We are prepared to defend our sovereignty, but we're not thinking about coalitions or these things. But this that is happening between Trump and the chairman of North Korea, it could happen with President Maduro as well. Why don't they meet? And why don't... This would solve everything, because Maduro is the boss of the government in Venezuela and Trump is the boss of the opposition in Venezuela. So that would be the correct way. But even apart from that, we must sit with the opposition as well. So this thing in Colombia, I believe that not even most of these countries of the Grupo de Lima, they would not support a military intervention, although they are helping to create the conditions, with all this trying to isolate Venezuela and the Venezuelan government and people. They have helped, but I don't think that they would support a military intervention. There are two countries that should be denounced all over the world, the U.S. and Colombia. Colombia is letting the U.S. use their territory to attack Venezuela.
I wanted to ask you in terms of what you said, a comment you made a few minutes ago, that the president has already survived, President Maduro has already survived the coup attempt. There were some articles I've seen in the financial press where the business community and the financial community is precisely worried about a drawn-out affair. Because there's a reality that there's a huge debt that Venezuela has to the world financiers in terms of its bond debt. There's the issue of what the further disruption of Venezuelan oil supply could mean to the world financial community, so that the business community, even of the United States, does not want a drawn-out, ongoing battle between the U.S. government and Venezuela. I'm wondering the discussions that your government has had with some of the oil companies that are invested in Venezuela and some of the bankers who have been lending money to Venezuela about the current crisis. If you're able to talk about that.
Yes, even American companies working in Venezuela, European companies, Asian companies, and they are working at the moment. They are producing oil and exporting oil, and they are worried because they want to keep on doing this oil production. So even the financial markets are worried because they don't want a war. They want everything to be calmed, and in the end, we can pay for all our debts if we are not under sanctions, if we're not blocked, if there are no aggressions against Venezuela. So that would be the best for the international markets. That's the reality. We have paid thousands and thousands and thousands of millions of dollars, billions of dollars with our debt and in the past, and we would be able to do so if they stop attacking Venezuela.
So I wanted to go to Fox Business, where John Bolton recently spoke, the national security advisor, openly saying U.S. oil companies could benefit from what's happening in Venezuela.
We're in conversation with major American companies now that are either in Venezuela or, in the case of Citgo, here in the United States. I think we're trying to get to the same end result here. Venezuela is one of the three countries I call the troika of tyranny. It'll make a big difference to the United States economically if we could have American oil companies really invest in and produce the oil capabilities in Venezuela. It'd be good for the people of Venezuela. It'd be good for the people people of the United States.
That's National Security Advisor John Bolton on Fox Business. Foreign Minister Adi Yazzie.
Bolton is like a gangster. When it's about Venezuela, he really is harsh, and there's no sense in what he says, but he has said something that is truth. All of this is about oil. No? They want Maduro out because they want to regain the control they had over the Venezuelan economy, and especially over PDVSA, our company, before the Bolivarian Revolution. They want the Venezuelan oil because it is the largest reserve of oil in all the world, and it's very close to the U.S. territory. And that is not going to happen because we will defend our territory, our people will be defended, and we have to sit down and give some. If they want to invest in Venezuela, Chevron is in Venezuela. So if other companies want to invest in Venezuela, they have to talk to us, they have to respect the Venezuelan law, and that's everything. But you cannot be toppling governments, ousting presidents in order to have control over the natural resources, although that's what Trump said recently, about that if he were to intervene other countries, he needed the loot in order to be paid for what they are doing. This cannot happen in Venezuela. That's why I'm telling you, this can be stopped here in the U.S. if you do the right things.
I wanted to ask you about the Lima Group. It's inconceivable. It would have been inconceivable 10 years ago that so many Latin American countries would have lined up with the United States condemning Venezuela, because there was a pink tide throughout Latin America of progressive and socially oriented governments. But now, of course, we've had a conservative tide now with Bolsonaro in Brazil and Duque in Colombia. Could you talk about the impact of the changes in Latin America on Venezuela's ability to withstand this kind of aggression?
These changes were not for free. The United States, the CIA, suddenly I believe that everything was concentrated in the Middle East. And when Barack Obama turned his face and he saw what they considered their backyard, he said, hey, look what's happening. This Chavez fellow and Lula and these people in Argentina and Nicaragua, we have to do something about this. And they began to send resources, to support candidates, to do campaigns against the left-wing candidates, and they regained governments which respond exclusively to the orders of the United States. And that's why the Lima Group exists. But this is going to change again, because the peoples of Latin America are watching, and they are analyzing the situation, and they feel that these governments do not represent them. Governments that want a war, governments that impose neoliberalism in their countries again. So this is going to change. We have to have some strategic patience in order to see how things will change again in Latin America.
And what is the role right now of Elliott Abrams? He's clearly Trump's point person, publicly chosen as the envoy to Venezuela, flew down in a military transport last week to Colombia. I want to go to a clip of Elliott Abrams recently speaking.
Maduro has proven he will manipulate any call for negotiations to his advantage, and he has often used so-called dialogues as a way to play for time. We urge all involved to deal solely with the legitimate Guaido government. The time for dialogue with Maduro has long passed.
So that's Elliott Abrams. The time for dialogue has long passed. Again, Vice President Pence in Colombia right now. I think a lot of people will be surprised to hear you being so calm at this point, as this weekend they announced that U.S. military action is now a possibility, a very serious intervention.
There are too many contradictions. I've met 2 times with Elliott Abrams during the last month, and we have had meetings that have lasted more than 2 hours with lots of differences, but we have maintained respect between us, and we have said our truths, and they are negotiating with us. We have just extended the presence of diplomats from the U.S. in Caracas for 15 more days, and this was agreed with the American delegation. It's Elliot Abrams and it's Kimberly Byer, the Undersecretary, and we have to keep on. So they say that that the opposition cannot have dialogue with the government, but they're having dialogue with us. So it's real politics here, what's happening, and we hope that this channel with Mr. Abrams or whomever is appointed by President Trump is always open, and that we can have contacts, because that's the civilized things to do, no, amongst countries that respect the sovereignty and the international law.
Well, that does it for the show for today. Jorge Arriaza, Venezuela's foreign minister. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Tammy Warnoff, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Massoud, Trina Ndura, Tamari Astudio, and Libby Rainey, Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, engineer. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Julie Crosby. To see our previous interview with the foreign minister and all of our coverage of Venezuela, go to democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Thanks for joining us.